looking at the Besorah, Part 6. I've entitled today's talk, Challenging the Talmidim, because it's looking at three situations where Yeshua is challenging, firstly, the four fishermen whom he had previously called to follow him, and also others who were following him around because they liked what they saw and what he did. However, it must be borne in mind that through the three synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there is considerable amount of repetition, with each saying the same thing in similar words. That is why I move freely between the three Gospels when speaking about a particular event. Further, the Gospel of John concludes by saying in its last verse, chapter 21, verse 25, there are also many things that Yeshua did, and if all these had been recorded, I don't think the world could contain all the books that would need to be written. So in many situations, the details are very sparse. Often it is necessary to read between the lines to find the context. Or alternatively, we can look to other scriptural sources, such as the Torah of Moshe and the prophets. With those thoughts in mind, let's start with Matthew chapter 8, verse 5, where we find Yeshua has come back to his adopted town of Capernaum, after he'd spent an unspecified time visiting many of the towns and villages around Central Galil, north of the lake. Now, upon arriving back from that journey, he again enters the synagogue on the Shabbat and begins teaching. And in Mark chapter 1, verse 22, it says, the people were amazed at the way he taught, for he did not instruct them just like the Torah teachers, but as one who had authority in himself. So turning to Matthew chapter 8, we see that a Roman army officer was pleading for help. Sir, my orderly is lying at home paralyzed and suffering terribly. Yeshua said, I will go and heal him. The officer showed the depth of his trust by responding, Sir, I am unfit for you to enter my house. Rather, if you will only give a command, my orderly will recover. For I too am a man under authority. I have soldiers under me. And I say to one, go, and he goes. To another, come, and he comes. To my slave, do this, and he does it. However, about the officer, Yeshua said to the crowd, who were probably in the synagogue with him, in Luke chapter 7, verse 9, I tell you that not even in Israel have I found such trust. And then in Matthew 8, 11 to 12, Yeshua goes on to berate his own people by saying, Moreover, I tell you that many will come from the east and the west and take their place at the feast in the kingdom of heaven with Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov. But those who are born for the kingdom will be thrown out in the dark, where people will wail and grind their teeth. That's speaking to his own generation of Israel because of their lack of trust. With those words, he was showing in advance that after his death and resurrection, many of the Goyim, or Gentiles, would be grafted into the Messianic community, alongside those from Israel who recognized and trusted his Messiahship. His words were a stinging indictment of many of the Perishim, or the Pharisees, and the Torah teachers who were present at that time, because they still did not believe or trust that he was the Mashiach. Luke concludes the events relating to the Roman officer by saying in 7 verse 10, when his messenger got back to the officer's house, they found the servant was in good health. Now going back to Luke chapter 5, we find that Yeshua once again is on the shores of Lake Kinneret, with the crowds pressing around him to hear what he's got to say about the words of God. They may well have been the same crowd that was earlier in the day, witnessing what occurred with the Roman officer. But whoever the crowd was, it was so numerous that Yeshua, seeing a boat belonging to Shim'on on the beach, instructed him to put out a short distance from the shore so that he could speak without being hemmed in and completely overwhelmed by the crowd. And when he'd finished speaking, Yeshua told Shim'on in verse 4, "Put out to the deeper water and let your nets down for a catch." What followed appeared to be Yeshua challenging the level of Shimon's faith and trust. Because when Yeshua arrived at the lake shore, Shim'on was busy cleaning his nets because they'd been fishing all night. Yeshua, knowing in advance what had happened, he asked Shim'on to put out into deeper water and let your nets down. In response, Shim'on brings forth the reality of the situation in verse 5 by saying, "We worked hard all night long, Rabbi, and haven't caught a thing. But if you say so, we will let our nets down." Reading between the lines, it appears that Shim'on, Andrew, Yaakov, and Yochanan, having earlier been called by Yeshua, had gone around the towns and the villages of the Central Galil. But now they're back in Capernaum. So what do? They immediately go back to fishing. Did they realize that they had agreed to follow Yeshua? In verses 6 and 7, it says that they caught so many fish that it started to tear the nets. That is the contrast between what had happened earlier in the morning when they caught nothing. Now it's a complete overload. So it must have profoundly impacted upon them just what had happened, the reality of the difference. So overwhelmed by what had occurred, Shim'on falls at the knees of Yeshua saying, "Get away from me, sir, because I'm a sinner." Was Shim'on reacting possibly because he'd suddenly come to realize the gravity of the situation? All three must have been consumed with guilt as to what had been going on. Then in verses 10 and 11, Yeshua quietly drives home the point of the whole exercise by saying, "Don't be frightened, for from now on you will be catching men alive." And as soon as they had beached their boats, they left everything behind and followed him. Clearly, it was a good outcome for all four. Now, switching from there to Mark chapter 4, verse 1, we see that there's a reference there to Yeshua teaching the crowd from the boat. But in verse 2, he goes on and launches into a parable about the farmer who went and sowed 4 types of seed, which we'll consider along with other parables in later sessions. But if we jump down to chapter 4, verse 35, the narrative appears to follow on from that earlier fishing experience. Evening had arrived, and Yeshua said to them, "Let's cross to the other side of the lake." To continue on in verse 36, leaving the crowd behind, they took him just as he was, in the boat, and there were other boats with him. Now verse 36 implies that through even the evening, the crowds would not leave Yeshua alone. Even though he'd set out in the boat and spoken to the crowds earlier in the day, and then he'd gone out fishing with Shim'on, but he wants rest. So he takes off across the lake for a break. But what happens? A violent storm develops, and the waves are breaking over the boat, and it's about to swamp. At that point, there is no future reference to the other boats that followed him out. Maybe they turned around and headed back to shore, which would be the logical thing to do. But the boat Yeshua's on continued right through into the teeth of the storm. But they wake him up in desperation, and he immediately rebukes the wind and the waves. "Quiet, be still." Instantly, the wind subsided, and there was dead calm. That had been another challenge to the depth of their faith and trust. As we see in verse 40, Why are you afraid? Have you no trust even now? After all they'd seen, they still did not trust him. Shim'on, Andrew, Yaakov, and Yochanan were all having to learn hard lessons about faith and trust in their new master. As we see in verse 41, it shows that they really still did not understand. They said themselves, "Who is this, that even he can control the wind and the waves?" Clearly, they still did not fully appreciate the magnitude of the one who had actually called them. Luke chapter 8 draws that frightening event to its conclusion in verse 26, where it says, "They sailed on and landed in the region of Gerasene, which is opposite Capernaum. By that stage, it is most likely dawn. There they meet the demon-possessed man who, for a long period, had been running around naked and dwelling in the burial caves outside the town." Verses 28 through 31 records the verbal exchange between Yeshua and the unclean spirits. One particularly interesting feature of that exchange that I want to consider in more detail is what was said by the unclean spirits. When Yeshua confronted them, he screamed out at Yeshua. Firstly, in Luke chapter 8, verse 28, "Yeshua, Son of God Ha-Elyon, what do you want with me? I beg you, don't torture me." Mark chapter 5 verse 7 says very much the same thing. However, when we come to Matthew chapter 8 verse 29, rather than one possessed man, it talks about two. "Have you come here to torture us before the appointed time?" As the one speaking is the unclean spirit, it may be just one man and a multiplicity of spirits, rather than two men and one spirit. Whether or not there were one or two men is not particularly important, but Yeshua then goes on to speak to the unclean spirit, saying, "What is your name?" The response, "Legion." The spirit replied, "Because there were so many of them." Then they begged Yeshua in Luke chapter 8 verse 31 not to send them into the bottomless pit. So what is behind this strange statement that was made by Legion? In answering the question, we need to cast our minds back to the words of Bereshit, or Genesis chapter 6 verse 4, where it says the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterwards, when the sons of God came down and took the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These were ancient heroes, men of renown. That verse is speaking of the Nephilim when it says that they were on the earth in those days and also afterwards. The context of the verse shows that the two periods are before and after the flood of Noah. But hang on, only 8 people survived that flood. So how could the Nephilim be present both before and after the flood? I believe it's because they were half human and half celestial. Being the offspring of the celestial sons of God and the human daughters of men, it means that the human part would have been destroyed in the flood, but the celestial, spiritual part would have survived. If that reasoning is correct, then it follows that the unclean spirits needed a host to survive on earth. So in the exchange between Yeshua and Legion, it is likely that the man was possessed by a large number of spirits from the ancient Nephilim, who had realized that they were actually being confronted by the one who had power to either imprison them or even destroy them. Jumping forward to the resurrection of Yeshua, we know that he rose on Shabbat afternoon. Therefore, there was a 12-hour gap between his resurrection and his encounter with the women at the tomb on the Sunday morning. Now, did Yeshua just drift around somewhere aimlessly for the missing 12 hours, or did he have a mission? If we consider the words of 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 18 through 20, we are told, He, Yeshua, was put to death in the flesh, but brought to life in the spirit. And in that form he went and made proclamation to the imprisoned spirits, to those who were disobedient long ago in the days of Noah, when God waited patiently during the building of the ark, in which few people, to be specific, 8, were delivered by means of water. Those imprisoned spirits were the sons of God, who'd taken the daughters of men and produced the Nephilim. They are the ones who, even today, are still being held in that bottomless pit that Legion spoke about, until the final judgment, when they will be destroyed, doubtless along with all the unclean spirits of the Nephilim. So it appears that Legion of the spirits was aware that they had come face to face with the one who held their future in his hands. That is why Legion begs Yeshua, don't torture me or /us before the appointed time. Returning to Luke chapter 8, verses 32-33, now there were many pigs feeding on the hills, and the demons begged him to let them go into these. So he gave them permission. The demons came out of the man and entered the pigs, whereupon the herd rushed down the hillside into the lake and were drowned. Later, Yeshua confirms what was happening to the man who had been possessed by Legion when he says in Matthew chapter 12, verses 43 to 45, when an unclean spirit comes out of a person, it travels through a dry country seeking to rest and does not find it. Then it says to itself, I will return to the house I left. When it arrives, it finds the house standing empty, swept clean, and put in order. Then it goes in and takes along with it 7 other spirits, more evil than itself, and they come to live there, so that in the end the person is worse off than he had been before. Yeshua concludes that statement in verse 45 by saying that this was about his own generation. This is how it will be for this wicked generation. So Yeshua, by sending Legion away into the pigs, showed that the unclean spirits were everywhere in his generation, and doubtless they are still residing in some people even today in the 21st century. Today, a person with an indwelling unclean spirit, or a multiplicity of them, is likely to manifest as what we now consider an advanced form of insanity. Turning again to Luke chapter 8, verses 38, we see there that the people in the Gerasene district heard what had happened, and they themselves became frightened and begged Yeshua to leave. But the man who'd been freed from the demon possession begged with Yeshua, take me with you in the boat. However, Yeshua brings the whole saga to an end in verse 39, saying, go back to your home. Tell how much the people have done. Tell how much God has done for you. And the man went away proclaiming throughout the whole town how much Yeshua had done for him. Finally, in Matthew chapter 9, verse 1, he, Yeshua, stepped into the boat, crossed the lake, and came to his own town, Capernaum. Now what we've seen there is the environment in which Yeshua taught and healed. That the majority of his generation still failed to acknowledge that he was the Messiah or the Son of Man. We have confirmation of this later when Stephen was facing a false accusation before the Sanhedrin, and spoke about that same generation in Acts chapter 7, verses 51 to 53, where he says, stiff-necked people with uncircumcised hearts and ears, you continually oppose the Ruach HaKodesh. You do the same things your fathers did. Which of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? They killed those who told in advance about the coming of the Tzaddik. That's the anointed one, Yeshua. And now you have become betrayers and murderers. You who received the Torah as having been delivered by angels, but you do not keep it. So that's what was happening in the first century, in the time of Yeshua, in the time of his ministry. So let's conclude by looking briefly at what we've considered this morning. Today we've considered that upon returning from an unstated period of teaching and healing in the towns of Central Galil, Yeshua is confronted by the Roman officer. And because of the depth of faith and trust of that man, he contrasts them with his own people Israel. The same day, he speaks to the crowd from Shimon's boat just off the shore. Then later he goes out into deeper water, and Shimon was told to cast his nets. The response reveals that Shimon and the three fishermen had spent the previous night fishing and caught nothing. Shimon pleaded with Yeshua to depart from his presence, but Yeshua's quiet response is asking him, as he did earlier, leave your fishing and your nets and come after me and fish for men. That very night, exhausted from a day of teaching and healing, Yeshua stepped into the boat, fell asleep, and they headed for the other side of the lake. But, of course, the storm rose up, and all four of them awoke Yeshua, and then came to the realization he has even power over the wind and the waves. And they still don't realize the significance of who they are actually working with. By morning, of course, they reached the other side of the lake, and the man there, possessed with demons, Legion, the unclean spirits. The dialogue that transpired between Yeshua and Legion reveals to all present the power he has over the spirit world. Cleansed and once again sane, the man begs Yeshua to take him back in the boat. But he can serve as a witness to all those east of the lake, because Yeshua will return to that district later in his ministry. And then finally, Yeshua and the four fishermen return to Capernaum. And next week, next Shabbat, we will again see how Yeshua calls more Talmidim and continues healing and teaching about the coming of the kingdom of God. Shabbat Shalom.